Hello everyone. We're going to be getting into Daniel's prophecies coming up in this channel. So I figured we'd kind of do an introductory video and discuss some of the principles of interpreting Daniel's prophecies. So when it comes to Daniel's prophecies, there are some things that are widely agreed upon and some things that are widely disputed or disagreed upon. And so we're going to be discussing one of those disputed areas this time, that being when do Daniel's prophecies apply. And so before we do so, I ask you to pray and ask for the Spirit's guidance and remove any preconceived ideas you have, and we're going to just go into it. And what I'm going to try to do is explain the three basic views that are out there and why I take the decision I do concerning Daniel's prophecies. Okay, so hopefully you've paused the video and prayed and you're ready with your Bible. Essentially, one of the things that's agreed upon, first I'll mention, or widely agreed upon, there may be some that have different views, but what most Bible students recognize is that Daniel's prophecies, the main prophecies in Daniel, are in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapters 11 and 12. And so most Bible students agree that Daniel 11 and 12 is a repeat and enlargement of Daniel 8. And Daniel 8 is repeating Daniel 7, and Daniel 7 is repeating Daniel 2. So you see it, Daniel 2, 7, 8, and 11 and 12 are all tied together and repeating each other with different aspects and different details, and usually enlargements. So that's one of the things that's widely agreed upon, and we're going to be looking at when these things apply, though. Alright? So the three basic views there are that these things apply anciently, right? They only apply to the ancient world, or they apply only in the future, or they apply over a large period of time, right? Reaching from the ancient world to the future. And the two first views that I mentioned, all applying in the ancient world and all applying in the future, hold the time prophecies in Daniel chapter 7 and 8 and 12 to be, literal days of short periods of time, relatively, in comparison to the other view. And that would be, either 1260 literal days, 1290, 1335, 1150, or 2300, depending on your reading of Daniel 8:14. You have those different time prophecies in the book of Daniel, and either they're viewed as being literal days, which would make them relatively short periods of time, totally in the past, right? Or totally in the future, or there's the view that it's larger periods of time covering from, anciently in the past to up until, modern times. And so we're going to be looking at, examining those views and seeing what they're really all about. So I'll just mention from the get-go, the view that I take is that Daniel's prophecies are covering a large period of history, right? Reaching from the ancient world up until the present day and beyond. And so I'll explain the reasons why, and as we go through this, I'm just going to briefly touch on the other ones. And so there's just notes that I wrote however many months back as I was examining this issue, or re-examining it, I should say. And so we're going to go over a few of them. So I'm just going to read some of the notes that I have here, and we're going to address it. So first off, we have the 2300 evenings, mornings, or days of Daniel 8:14, right? And it's evenings and mornings in Hebrew, or evening, morning. And so people interpret that different ways. If you have 2300 evening mornings, some people take that to mean 2300 evenings and 2300 mornings, which would be 2300 days. Or 2300 evenings and mornings collectively, which collectively would be 1150 days. So those are a couple of the different ways of reading that, with the literal reading of it being literal days. And so you have the two views, in the past or in the future. So here's a few of the issues that I have with viewing it as being all in the past. Okay, first of all, we have Daniel 8, even within the prophecy. Daniel 8 verse 17 says, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." Right? So right here, just a couple of verses after Daniel 8:14, it says this is referring to the time of the end. Right? So that doesn't really sound like it's just a vision for antiquity. And then we have also Daniel chapter 10 verse 14, which is part of this repeating and expansion. It says, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days." So we see this whole thing is for the latter days. And of course Daniel 12 verse 4 also says, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." And then verse 9 also says, "And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." Right? So it's pretty clear in the book of Daniel that Daniel's prophecies are intended for the time of the end. Right? And that's when they'll be understood, unsealed. Right? They were sealed up to everyone's understanding. Then the last days they're to be unsealed. Okay, and so we also have in Daniel 8:26, it says, let's see here, Daniel 8:26, "And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut up thou the vision, and it shall be for many days." So the vision of the evening and morning is the vision of the 2300 days, and that would be shut up and it would be for many days. Okay, so all these things are pointing to it not just being a prophecy just for the ancient world, right? And of course we get into the issue of many people apply Daniel chapter 8 and the daily being taken away and all these things to what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll address that as well. When we compare Daniel 8 with Daniel 11, which Daniel 8, when you read it, in verses 11 and 12 and 13, it talks about the daily being taken away. And I'm not saying daily sacrifice because the word sacrifice is actually not in the text. Okay, Daniel uses the word daily, which in Hebrew is tamid, differently than any other usage in the Bible. Okay, all throughout the Bible it's tamid this, tamid that, continual, daily, the daily burnt offerings, the fire was burning daily, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that were tamid, daily. But here, Daniel, he uses it differently. He doesn't use it as a verb, or sorry, not a verb, but as an adjective or an adverb. He only uses it as a noun, hatamid, which is the daily, right? Hatamid. So the daily was taken away. Now when you compare that in Daniel 11, verse 31 is when the daily is taken away in Daniel 11. Now here's the thing of why it does not make sense, or one of the reasons why it cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes that's being referred to. In Daniel 11, I'll just read my note here, it says, "Daniel 11 also points out that the daily would not be taken away till Greece divides in four, the southern division gets defeated by the king of the north, there comes a raiser of taxes, the prince of the covenant is broken, the king of the north third regime falls, and the fourth regime of the king of the north rises." Right? All that has to happen before the daily is taken away in Daniel 11. And some of that probably didn't make sense to you guys because, what's this with the king of the north and the third regime and the fourth regime and all that. We'll do a video soon on Daniel chapter 11. Just look for it. By the time you're watching this video, I may have already uploaded it. There'll be a playlist called Daniel. And in Daniel 11, in that video, I'll explain what I mean by the different regimes of the king of the north and king of the south. But I'll put it like this: Antiochus Epiphanes would definitely be before all those things take place. All right, before Greece is divided into four. You have Greece defeated by the king of the north, right? And then you have even a third and fourth regime of the king of the north come in before the daily is taken away. So, anyways, like I said, that'll be explained more later in another video. Now, another issue is if we accept the New Testament, Christ talks about Daniel's prophecy in Matthew 24, verse 15. And this is what he says. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Right? So Christ was clearly applying this prophecy of Daniel, right, the daily being taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate put in its place. He was applying that future from himself. So that whole Antiochus Epiphanes thing and the whole thing happening in Daniel's day, it does not really work. And, you know, there's a number of reasons, but those are a few of why Daniel's prophecies can't be applied solely to the ancient world. And that's just touching mainly on Daniel 8's prophecies. There's other reasons in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 and Daniel 11. Okay, so moving on now to the second view where we apply the whole thing just to the future, right? And here's a few of the different issues with that. Okay, one issue with that is when people say that all of Daniel's prophecies apply to the time of the end, one of the reasons that they're doing that is because the verses that I just read, you know, Daniel 8:17 and so on and so forth, right? Where it says the vision is for the time of the end, right? So people say, oh, the vision's for the time of the end, therefore the whole vision takes place in the time of the end, right? Now we're going to look at a number of issues with that. One is that if the whole thing takes place in the time of the end, right, then how can we have it in Daniel 11, for example, and we're going to go over a few examples, but Daniel 11, we're going to see that if we just take the text as it reads, the daily is taken away before the time of the end. So we just saw it's taken away after the four divisions of Greece and after different regimes of the king of the north, right? So it's after that, and it's after Christ, right? But it is before the time of the end. And here are a few of the reasons why. Okay, Daniel chapter 11, verse 29 says, And at the appointed time he shall return, and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former, or as the latter. Right? So at the appointed time, and what is the appointed time? Going to verse 31, And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that make the desolate. Then verse 35 says, And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for an appointed time. So you notice something here. Verse 29, you have the appointed time referred to in verse 29 is still future from verse 29. And we're not going into the interpretation of what all this means in this video. We're just dealing with what the text itself says. So there's the reading of the text, as in what do these words say. Then there's the interpretation of what do these words portray, right? We're not looking at that. Just what do these words mean, basically? What are the words themselves saying? We have in verse 29, from whatever that's talking about, it's saying the appointed time is future from itself. Then you keep reading, verse 31, the daily is taken away. You get to verse 35, and it clarifies what that appointed time is. That's the time of the end, which is still yet future from verse 35. So if the time of the end is still future from verse 35, right, and verse 31 is when the daily was taken away, then clearly the daily is taken away before the time of the end. And you only get to the time of the end in verse 40 when it says, And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, etc., etc. So what we have there is clearly just by the reading of the text, the daily is taken away before the time of the end. So when somebody reads Daniel 8, verse 17, it says, well, the vision refers to the time of the end, right? And says, therefore, the whole thing is in the time of the end. Well, it doesn't really work because the daily has to be taken away before the actual time of the end, just according to the text itself. However, the vision is still for the time of the end, right? And that's another issue. And what does it mean for it to be for the time of the end? Does it mean that the entire thing takes place in the time of the end? Or does it mean that it's to be understood in the time of the end? Well, I submit that Daniel chapter 12 clarifies that it's to be understood in the time of the end, and that it points to the time of the end, right? And, because in Daniel 12 it says that the book will be unsealed in the time of the end, and knowledge shall increase, and we'll understand these things. Like it says in verse 10 of Daniel 12, that the wise shall understand. Okay, another thing. Daniel 8:14 is the answer to the question of verse 13. Now, Daniel 8:13, actually, let's just read both verses. Daniel 8:13 and 14. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So what we have here is, the question is, how long is the vision concerning the daily and the transgression, etc.? The answer, 2,300 days, 2,300 evening mornings, right? Now, many people interpret that to mean that the 2,300 days starts when the daily is taken away. But is that what the question is? Is the question, how long shall it be from the taking away of the daily? Well, we know in Daniel chapter 12, in verse 11 it says, and from the time the daily shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Okay, so we know that Daniel was well capable of using words that clearly portray a time prophecy starting when the daily is taken away and the abomination set up, like it says in Daniel 12:11. But here it doesn't say that. It doesn't say how long shall it be from the taking away of the daily. It says, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily. So I'll put it like this, just modern example, just so we understand what we're talking about. If I ask someone, how long does a tortoise live? Well, the answer will be the answer to that question, how long a tortoise lives. Now, if I ask somebody, how long is the movie about lifespan of tortoises, I guess it'd be documentary, how long is the documentary about the lifespan of tortoises, the answer will be dramatically different, right? So here we're not asking how long from the taking away of the daily, but how long is the vision concerning the daily, right? Hopefully you get the distinction there. So when he asks how long is the vision, the answer is 2,300 days, right? So now the vision of Daniel 8, which is the vision of the daily, that's the only vision of the daily that existed at that time, what we have there is that the vision of the daily goes back to the ram and the he-goat at the beginning. So the 2,300 days extends all the way from the days of the ram and the he-goat all the way up until the cleansing of the sanctuary. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And so we'll look more what that means in the actual video going through Daniel 8. Right now we're discussing principles of interpretation. Okay, so and now one thing I'll mention too is if we interpret this to be all in the last days still, we're going to have to reinterpret what these beasts mean, the ram and the he-goat. Okay, so I'll just read my note here. It says, Daniel 8:14 is the answer to the question of verse 13, which is how long is the vision concerning the daily, not how long shall it be from the taking away of the daily. So Daniel 8:14 is telling us how long the vision is. The vision starts with a ram and a he-goat. So if the duration of time spoken of in Daniel 8:14, that would mean that only within a few years all of Daniel 8 would have to be fulfilled. If this was the case, we would have to reinterpret the beasts of the vision to be modern nations rather than going with the angel's own interpretation. Daniel 8:19 to 26. Now, we're not going to read it all, but if you read Daniel 8:19 to 26, the angel clearly interprets what these different beasts are, and says so clearly that it says the ram that thou sawest, verse 20, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And it's just really straightforward. Oh yeah, this is Greece, and this is Medo-Persia, and just, couldn't be clearer, really. So we're going to have to then, I'll put it like this, if we're going to put the whole thing in the future, now we have to make the explanation of the symbols a symbol itself, right? So you have the initial symbol, the beast, and then you have the explanation given by the angel, Medo-Persia and Greece. Now if we're going to put all these things just in the last days, now we have to all of a sudden make the explanation of the symbol to be a symbol which needs an explanation. So it just seems to be adding a lot of unnecessary complications and complexity to it, right? Okay, another thing, if this is yet future, would the sanctuary, right, because it's talking about the sanctuary being trodden underfoot and the cleansing of the sanctuary and all that, would the sanctuary be an earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem, which is one of the main ideas, or the church, which would in turn affect the heavenly sanctuary, which is another view? In connection with this, would the daily be animal sacrifices, or would it be something else, as the daily times of worship, or so on? Now, if we interpret this, and the reason why I mention these is because these are the possible interpretations that I'm aware of, if it's all in the future. If the sanctuary is an earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem, it wouldn't harmonize with what all the other prophets have to say will happen in Jerusalem in the last days. And if you want to know about that, please just check out the video, or the playlist, sorry, that I have called The Premillennial Kingdom. And I have a bunch of videos there dealing with that subject of what is to happen in the Promised Land, in Jerusalem, in the last days. Now, I also want to mention here, because some people might say, well, yeah, but all those other prophets, that was just for their day, right? Which I also go into in those videos that I referenced, the Premillennial Kingdom videos. Or some other people might say, oh, those prophecies were conditional, they didn't have to happen. But Daniel, his prophecy is still going to happen. Now, here's the problem with that. Daniel chapter 10, verse 21, the angel is about to delineate Daniel chapter 11 and 12 for Daniel. And this is what the angel says to Daniel just before he gets into it. Daniel 10:21. But I will shew thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that holdeth with me in these things but Michael your prince. So what we have here is the angel saying to Daniel, I will show you that which is noted in the scripture of truth. So Daniel is hearing that and he's saying, okay, you're going to show me what is noted, what is shown in the scripture of truth. And what was the scripture of truth to Daniel? Well, of course, to Daniel, the scriptures that he had were the writings of the prophets before him, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea, and, we have all these other prophets that Daniel knew of and had their writings, right? Of course, he didn't have the writings of some of them like Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi because they came after him, but the majority of the prophets that are written in the Old Testament came before Daniel. And so what he was showing Daniel in Daniel 11 was noted in the scripture of truth. So in other words, Daniel's prophecies are tied in to the other prophecies, right? So when we try to interpret them separately from the rest of the Bible and say those other prophecies don't have to happen, or what they say is going to happen in Jerusalem in the last days isn't what Daniel says, we're just confusing the whole thing, right? And we're taking Daniel out of his context because the angel told him that he was going to show him what was noted in the scriptures of truth, right? So we need to keep these things in mind and be careful not to interpret Daniel with disregard of the other prophecies of, all throughout what people call the minor prophets, right? And even, the major prophets such as, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, right? We need to understand these prophecies in order to correctly understand Daniel. We cannot understand Daniel properly without these other prophecies. Okay, so going on. Yes, it would not harmonize with the other prophecies of what would happen in Jerusalem in the last days if it's to be an earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem that is being spoken of in Daniel. Why is that? Well, the way lots of people interpret it is that as though there's going to be a literal sanctuary in the land of Jerusalem, and there will be animal sacrifices, and that's going to be the daily, and then the daily is taken away. There's a number of problems with that, and one is what I just explained there about the other prophecies. Another is that the daily is taken away. Let's just read this, Daniel 11:31. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now, look what's being said here. It's saying that they're going to take away the daily and place the abomination, right? And that's polluting the sanctuary, right? So here's the problem. If there's a sanctuary set up in the last days and there's going to be animal sacrifices there, that's already an abomination. And so how could you take away that abomination and place something else, call it abomination, and say that's polluting the sanctuary? Well, if that was the case, the sanctuary would already be polluted. So the daily must be something good, and the sanctuary must be something good, which is why it's called the sanctuary of strength, right? So that view doesn't really work. And then you have the other view of saying that the sanctuary is God's people in the last days, and the daily is the daily times of worship, which again is a whole other issue which perhaps a lot of people watching this video are unfamiliar with. And if so, please view the videos in the playlist called Lord's Supper Daily. That's on this channel as well. Now here's the problem there. If the sanctuary, right, is the church or God's people in the last days, and the daily is the daily times of worship, how could that be taken away from God's people in the last days, since they do not even know what the daily is, right? In other words, how can you take something away from people that they don't even have? You know, you can't take something away from someone if they don't even have that thing. And secondly, if that's the case, don't we already know that if we understand the daily to be those daily times of worship, etc., which, if you don't comment, we can discuss these things. You know, if you understand the daily to be that, you have to already know that that was already taken away from God's people during the Dark Ages and has now been recently restored. So what you'd have to say is that the daily was taken away and Daniel didn't talk about it, right? And now it's just being restored, but it's going to be taken away just for a short time, and then it's going to be restored again. And that's what Daniel talked about. But how could it be taken away if it's daily times of prayer, etc., etc.? How could that be taken away from a people who will live to see its restoration? In other words, how could, if I'm keeping the daily and daily times of prayer and so on, and then that's taken away from me, how is that even possible to take it away from me if I know about it, right? The only way that would seem to make sense to take it away is to take it away from people's remembrance, their knowledge. So how would that even happen, right? And then there's a few other issues as far as the duration for how long it's taken away that then become an issue, which we'll look at in just a few minutes here. Okay, so we also have here, okay, I was just looking at my notes here that I wrote however long ago, and I already explained some of this here. So, let's see. Yeah, I just put here, will it be forgotten for 1150 or 2300 days? Will we just simply forget it for that long and then suddenly remember it again? Right? The daily. One other logical issue here with the view of it all being in the latter days, Daniel's prophecies that is that what we'd be saying is that there was prophecies in the Old Testament showing what was to happen with God's people all throughout the Old Testament times, right? Like any Bible student knows that there was prophets all throughout the Old Testament, and God spoke through them to reveal to his people what would happen. And then we have prophecies leading up to the time of Christ. And then, all of a sudden, you have no prophecies for 2,000 years. Nothing to help God's people during that time. Why would God leave his people with absolutely nothing, you know? And then, boom, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of prophecies again, all very tightly compact, and a lot of things happening in a very short period of time, just within a few years in the latter days, right? So why would God leave that 2,000 year period without saying anything? Whereas if you take the view that the prophecies are covering a large period of time, like the angel said, the vision is long, then you don't have a problem. God is showing his people all the way through. The other thing is that if the purpose is to point out the time of the end, how do you point something out with no reference point? In other words, you just have nothing for an unmentioned period of time, right? The only reason why I mentioned 2,000 years is because that's how long it's been so far. We have nothing for, an unmentioned period of time, and then all of a sudden a bunch of things. How does that help the people in the last days? Because here they are, they have no reference point to know when those prophecies happen because they have nothing leading up to a certain point. Whereas if you take the view, and these are just logical points right now, but if you take the view that these prophecies are delineating the history of the world, and they're for the last days, then it makes sense because in the last days, the prophecies are unsealed, and they can go and see, okay, look, here is the history of the world, right? Here is everything, or I'll put it like this, here's everything that has been leading up to where we are, right? Leading up to where we are, leading up to where we are, and then here's these things that haven't happened yet, right? So that lets me know where I am. If I see the things in the past, leading right up with no breaks all the way up into the future, I can clearly see the things which are past and the things which have not yet happened, which lets me know exactly where I am in the prophecy, right? So that makes more sense for it to be for the time of the end, because those in the time of the end will understand it and it will be a benefit to them because they won't get here and realize, okay, now I think we're in the time of the end because I think we understand this, but I don't have a reference point for when this is happening, and this just looks like that, this looks like that, and this looks like what it says in newspapers, and you know what I'm saying? You end up having no actual solid reference point. Okay, so we're going to look at two other issues here. One thing that I just want to mention is that the plain reading of the text of Daniel, right? When you read Daniel 2, and he says, you are that head, Nebuchadnezzar, and after you will rise up another kingdom, right? And after that kingdom, another kingdom, and after that kingdom, another kingdom. It's very simple that Daniel was referring to Nebuchadnezzar and saying, hey, this golden head actually represents Babylon. And then this next power represents the power to come after that, which by the time you get to Daniel 8, it even tells you Medo-Persia. It says it clearly, it just tells you Medo-Persia. Then the next power, Greece. And then the next power, although it doesn't specifically say Rome in Daniel, it's very easy to see. You get what I'm saying? It's just the simple reading of it. Otherwise, if I take Daniel 2 and say, oh, all that is just nations in the time of the end, then okay, now all of a sudden the explanation of the symbol now becomes a symbol which needs an explanation, right? Same thing that we saw in Daniel 8. And we have to do that for the whole thing, so we have to reinterpret the interpretation of the symbol. And so it adds so many layers of complexity that are really unnecessary. And when we just take it as it reads, it's very simple. And some people, I'll just mention again, for Daniel 8, well, when we go into Daniel 8, I'll explain it more. And the daily, there's too much information on the daily to cover in any one video. So I'm just going to mention, check out the channel or the playlist in this channel called Lord's Supper Daily, and that'll help to explain a lot. I just want to mention, some people say, oh well, Daniel 8:14 has to refer to literal days, right? Because it says 23rd evening mornings, right? And people say, oh, the evening morning has to be the morning and evening sacrifices, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. Every time it talks about the evening and morning sacrifices, it doesn't word it like that. It never says evening and morning. It always says morning and evening. here in Daniel 8, it's the opposite. It's evening, morning, which is just like in Genesis 1, evening and morning, one day, right? So 2300 days is a fair interpretation. It's not the literal reading, obviously. It's 2300 evening, mornings. But it is a very, very, clear and easy to see interpretation, and in fact even more straightforward than saying it's the daily sacrifices at the third and ninth hour, simply because it's the opposite order and it's never the opposite order, and there has to be a reason why Daniel didn't say sacrifices, right? Why he just said ha-tamid, right? A noun. All of a sudden the daily, this thing that had been used for so long as an adjective, all of a sudden becomes a noun, the daily. And I'll have another video explaining more clearly what daily is and exactly when the daily was taken away and all those different things. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Just one other thing here that we want. Here is just a quick thing that I've drawn here to explain one of the issues with Daniel's prophecy being interpreted as being just for the last days, as being literal days, etc., etc. Okay, so I know some of it is probably a little hard to read, but I'm going to do the best I can. What we have here, and we went through this in, just earlier in the video, we have at some point Daniel 11, the daily, taken away, and that's Daniel 11:31, right? And we saw that that is before the time of the end, right? Time of the end is here, and that's Daniel 11 verse 40, right? Daniel 11 verse 31, daily taken away. Daniel 11 verse 40, time of the end, right? And Daniel 11:31 to 40 takes place here. Now here's the issue, right? It's taken away before the time of the end. The 1290 and the 1335, let's say that these are literal days, right? Then what we have is the 1290 starting at the taking away of the daily, and that's before the time of the end, right? And then we have all these things in Daniel 11:31 to 40, and please just go and read those verses, and you'll see that what takes place there, it even is at one point within that says, for it is yet for an appointed time, right? The time of the end is yet for an appointed time, showing that there would be an extended period of time from verse 35 to verse 40. It's yet for the time appointed. Just wait. It's saying there's still time to take place. So we have some sort of extended period of time going on between the taking away of the daily and the time of the end, and that's delineated in verses 31 to 40 of Daniel 11. And we have these 1290 and 1335, apparently, according to some, literal days, right, that take place here, right? And so what that would mean is that the time of the end is actually a lot shorter than even 1290 days, because the 1290 days starts when the daily is taken away, and the daily is taken away before the time of the end. Therefore, the time of the end begins during the 1290 days. And so if it begins during it, it can't comprehend the whole thing. It only has to comprehend a latter portion of it, right? So then we have all of a sudden this thing that we call the time of the end being shortened down to this tiny little period of just, probably less than a couple years, especially considering all the things that are to take place from Daniel 31 to Daniel 40. And the time of the end has to come after Daniel 11:31 to 40, or it comes at verse 40, we should say. And then the other problem with that is that Daniel 12 verses 4 and verse 9 let us know that the vision would be sealed up until the time of the end, but in the time of the end, the vision would be unsealed. So therefore, what that would mean is that we are only to understand Daniel's prophecy for just a period of under a couple years, and it would only be revealed at that time. So any of the people in that case saying that Daniel's prophecies are for the latter days, right, and that the entire thing only takes place in the latter days, and that these are just literal days. The taking away of the daily is future, the time of the end is future, 1290, 1335, all future, all literal days. If we're saying that, we cannot even give an interpretation of Daniel and say it's correct, because according to this, Daniel's vision is still sealed up. So everything that you have to offer on this, if this is your interpretation, can only be private interpretation. Now, some people might think that's a little harsh, but that's just the truth of it, isn't it? And if it's not, please explain to me how it's not. Because as far as I can see, if these are all literal days and all of this is all totally in the future, then this vision, this whole book of Daniel, is still sealed up. And to interpret it would be folly, right? To say that I have the truth on it when the Bible is saying that it's sealed up. In other words, it's a self-defeating position to take, because it's saying we can't know what this means, but it's not what you're saying, it's all in the future. So at least if you're going to take the position that it's all in the future, you should not be able to say to somebody else, it's not what you're saying, because you're saying to yourself that you can't understand it because you're saying it's sealed up, right? So anyways, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that kind of explains some of the problems that come into play if we're interpreting this as all something of the past, right? Or as all something to take place entirely in the future. Hopefully I've clearly explained why neither of those can really be the case, and why the natural reading of the text is that Daniel's prophecies cover an extended period of time, covering from the days of old up until the future, right? So again, blessings to you all. Hopefully this has made sense, and even though this drawing here is nothing special, hopefully it's at least illustrated visually for you this complication and this discrepancy. So blessings, comment, and look for the videos coming up soon going through Daniel.